The first one is to minimize the use of intensifying adverbs. In module number 1, last March, I talked about verbs such as technically, actually, absolutely, basically, essentially. Those things we've discussed that if you can, minimize them as much as you can. But I'm also going to add other types of intensifying adverbs in this session, and that is simple adverbs such as very and super. I'll give you an example. Saying, oh, he's very nice. He's very smart. He's very beautiful. He's very approachable. He's very helpful. These are good words, and there's nothing wrong with them. But when it comes to the level of sophistication, there are better ways to describe a person, and you can use a one-word adjective rather than using very or super. For reasons that in professional speaking or professional writing, these words are usually associated with casual language. I'll give you some examples later on. Number 2, I want you to be very specific with your adjective according to the context. For example, if you are describing a person, let's say you're hiring someone at work, your manager told you, Jonathan, how was the interview of your associate manager who you're planning to hire? And you think that the person in this case is smart. So when you reply to your manager and say, candidate number 2 is very smart, or simply put, smart. If I'm listening to you and I hear the word smart, and if I was your manager, it doesn't give me much clue to what exactly do you mean by smart. And for that reason, you're burdening me to think about the word smart and ask with a follow-up question, when you said smart, what do you mean? And that's not a good thing, conversation-wise. You want to make it easy for the person to understand why did you say the word smart. So for example, the word smart has many other angles to consider. For example, you can cover the personality angle. If what you really meant was that the person that you were interviewing was able to observe a lot of things during the interview, such as, I noticed that your people are very quiet in the office. And you know that the observation was true, and so you think that the person is smart because the person was able to capture the right things that a lot of people wouldn't notice. Don't use the word smart, use the word observant. Another example, let's say the person was very good with his communication skills. The person was very fluent in English. The person was able to answer the questions immediately and didn't need enough time to think about it. Many of us are misled to think that when someone speaks confidently, they're automatically smart. Not true at all. They just happen to be good with their words. So don't use the word smart, use the word eloquent, because that is a skill pertaining to one's communication. Okay? Third one, let's say, for example, the person in the job interview, you gave him a IQ test, where they have to solve a puzzle. You give them a set of pencil and ball pen, or you give them a truck or a candle, and they have to do something about it. And the person got the question right. He was able to solve the puzzle. Many times, that ability does not mean that the person is smart. Perhaps the person is resourceful. Perhaps the person is innovative. So whatever it is, if you gave me a more specific adjective, if I was the listener, I'll have a better idea why you chose that word. That makes you more sophisticated. That makes you more insightful in your responses. Another example, when you listen to the candidate in the job interview and the person has a way with words, his tone, the way he compliments you, he's very charming. And when he talks about being a manager, he mentions that a lot of people like him or her. The person's not necessarily smart. The person is charming. The person has good influence skills. So when you become a more specific describer, if I were to use that term, you're more insightful. And that helps. If I was a person listening, I don't need to burden myself with a follow-up question. Same thing happens in an elevator. Your VIP director or president suddenly does an elbow with you and say, oh, Jonathan, I haven't seen you for a while since COVID-19. How is your job these days? Please don't say the word, it's good. We're busy. Can I get an exclamation mark if you can relate to that? I'm sure a lot of you have been guilty about that. When you use those words, it sounds, I'm going to use this word, it sounds very pedestrian. Sometimes it can sound dumb. Sometimes it can sound very ordinary that the person can forget you. And in many situations, it does not give the person an incentive to ask more. Remember, it's an elevator discussion. It could be your one in a lifetime exposure to that director. Give him an insightful answer. It's challenging, but we're pivoting to the digital world. That probes and that provokes the CEO and say, when you say pivoting, John, could you tell me more about it? What exactly are you working on? So you see the difference? Your choice of words can make the person be interested and curious more to ask from you. That's what you want at the end of the day when it comes to visibility and influence. And this, my dear friends, is only made possible if you have a wider range of vocabulary. Let's minimize and let's minimize the usage of the word he's nice, he's okay, he's good. These are very normal words, and a typical grade school or high school student can also use them. Cut above the rest and use more sophisticated, more insightful, and more specific words that can describe your emotions. Okay, let's capture one more example. Very noisy. So for example, one of your teammates asks you, John, I noticed that you don't smile often when it's Jeremy who talks, who's inside the office. Why? And then you say, I don't like Jeremy because he's just very noisy. That's fine for a casual conversation. But when someone starts claiming that you don't like Jeremy and let's say there was a confrontation, you might want to consider words that can make you sound more professional. So for example, very noisy has a lot of other synonyms or other choice of words that can give a different angle. You can say rowdy. Rowdy is a more specific word. It has a dimension of not just being talkative or noisy, it has a dimension of being disorderly, right? Another word would be sociable. If you're planning to say something good about the person, but some people don't think that he's that in a good light, you can positively phrase it. You know, Jeremy isn't noisy. He's just sociable because he loves talking to a lot of people. So if you're on Jeremy's side, you can cancel out the word noisy and say sociable or interactive or loves to please other people, for example. Another angle we can look at is loud. Loud may sound simple, but it has more connotation compared to saying very noisy, especially when you put silence in between. So for example, I'll act it out. Yes, I am not fond of Jeremy. And the reason for that is Jeremy just happens to be, should I say, loud. Can I get the letter L if you got my sarcasm and if you got some of my tone when I said that? That's another example how I was able to sophisticate the sentence without having to choose a different, without having to choose very noisy, but I got my point across. And that loud has something to do with the idea that he loves his own voice. That's, by the way, another example of describing it. You can say, you know, Jeremy is the kind of person who loves listening to his own voice. That's an example of making the sentence sophisticated, but when you're talking to someone who's smart enough, he understands that you don't like Jeremy's voice and you think that Jeremy keeps on talking when it's unnecessary. Another example, inconsiderate of surrounding. Here's another way, you know, you wanted to say something not so good about Jeremy, but you want to say it in a way that will not hurt Jeremy's feelings. So you can say, Jeremy's a fine guy. It's just that he's inconsiderate of his surroundings when the situation calls for it, such as after lunch or when it's crunch time around 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock p.m. when people are hurrying to get their job done. When you say that you're inconsiderate of your surrounding, you're adding another element, and that is a call to action element. You're implying that not only is Jeremy noisy, you want him to slow down or please be silent in situations when this is being called for. Why is it important? There are some people that when you tell them that they're noisy, they just say, noted, and they're not going to do anything about it. Sometimes you have to spoon feed the call to action to them and tell them, Jeremy, we find you very noisy.